Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 91 of the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. Later in today's episode, Steve Adcock is going to be joining us again. Steve is coming back after his first stop on the podcast, which was way back in episode 16. Steve has built a really cool financial independence lifestyle for himself, and he shares some of his valuable financial insights far and wide in a very succinct and understandable and convincing manner, and I think you'll really enjoy hearing what Steve has to say. But first, let's do a customary review of the week. This one comes in from Shaq and Kobe, who left us a review on Apple Podcast, a 5-star review, saying, definitely a must-add to your weekly finance podcasts. I like to try lots of new finance podcasts to see if I like them. Sometimes I have to listen to 3 or 4 or 5 episodes to get a true feel of if the podcast will be beneficial to me. But with the Best Interest Podcast, I could tell after just the first episode that I chose to try. I followed the podcast immediately, and now this podcast is part of my regular routine. Well, Shaq and Kobe, I hope you're doing well. Thank you for those kind words. And if you hear this, Shaq and Kobe, drop me an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog, and we will get you hooked up with a super soft Best Interest t-shirt. And now, before Steve Adcock joins us today, I want to ask you listeners a question. And that question is, how well do you know your frame? What do I mean by your frame? Let's go back to friend of the blog, Anthony. Anthony was around and would read some of my very first articles that I wrote for the Best Interest blog when I shared them on Facebook way back in 2018 and 2019. Anthony's seen the Best Interest grow over time. And a couple years ago, this is probably going back to 2022, I told him that the Best Interest wasn't exactly what I wanted it to be. I felt pretty directionless at the time, and I was considering hanging up my writing gloves for good. And in fact, it was during that time where I wasn't recording this podcast at all. I hung up my podcasting microphone for really, it was like 18 months, just because before those 18 months, I didn't feel a real passion for the podcast, and I didn't feel like I had a real direction for the podcast. And so I was talking to Anthony about this, and he said, you know, Jesse, you can't see the picture if you're standing inside the frame. I'm outside the frame of the Best Interest, so trust me when I say that you've got something special going on here. The Best Interest is really cool. It's different. It's unique. And I can see that from outside the frame. And you might not be able to see that, Jesse, from where you are inside the frame. That was a big turning point for me. And I'm obviously overjoyed that the Best Interest has journeyed on to become what it is today. And that quote, that you can't see the picture if you're inside the frame, it's a pivotal part of the human condition. But many of us remain blind to it, even after we're aware of the quote. Even after we're aware of how true that idea is, it's still hard to remain cognizant of that idea. It's a daily challenge to remove ourselves from our frames and gain a true outside perspective of what's going on in our lives. Now, that same theme, that same idea, it's integral to David Foster Wallace's famous speech, "This is Water," which longtime readers and longtime listeners will have seen me quote countless times. As Foster Wallace explains, the point is that the most obvious and important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Foster Wallace goes on to explain, and I'm going to read you a somewhat long quote here, quote, "Here is just one example of the total wrongness of something that I tend to automatically be sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid, and most important person in existence. We rarely think about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive, but it's pretty much the same for all of us. It is our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There's no experience you have had that you are not the absolute center of. Your world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV, on your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, real." And that's the quote from David Foster Wallace. We are all stuck inside our own frames, our own frame of reference. We must first realize and accept that truth, and only then can we attempt to strategize a way out of our own frames and hopefully execute that strategy with some sort of success. Okay, what does this all have to do with personal finance? Well, our natural self-centered framing certainly affects our interactions with money. The most obvious way to me harkens back to a terrific Charlie Munger quote. The world is not driven by greed, it's driven by envy. In other words, we don't simply want more stuff, right? That's greed. Instead, we want more stuff because we see and feel envy toward other people who have that stuff. We get jealous, right? I want it too. That's exactly what Katie Gotti-Tassin, who was just here on episode 89, it's what Katie wrote about in her recent article called Mimetic Desire and Consumer Choice, right? Mimetic desire, we see what other people have, we see what other people are spending on, and we want that stuff too. We want to mime other people. We recently spent a weekend at a rental lake house here in the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. It was this really nice, kind of old school, old-fashioned cottage, probably like a 1,500-foot, 2,000-square-foot cottage on Canandaigua Lake, a beautiful lake, beautiful views. But as we went up and down our little shoreline, we were certainly staying in the smallest and the oldest of all the nearby lake houses. Canandaigua Lake has one of the highest tax rates in the country. There's a lot of really, really nice property there. And I laughed to myself and I began thinking about what ended up being this article, what ended up being this monologue that I'm speaking to you right now, when I compared our rental house to the neighbors' houses. And I thought, what would it be like to have the quote unquote worst of the $1 million lake houses? What effect would that have on the psyche? Now, it's easy for you and I to sit here and think to ourselves, well, I wouldn't care, right? I would take a bad $1 million lake house any day of the week. And maybe that's true. But envy does drive the world, and many people would be affected by that. Isn't that wild that some people would sit there and say, sure, I have a $1 million lake house, but it actually doesn't feel too good because look at the beautiful neighbors' houses. I'm sitting in the worst of all these houses. It really would affect some people. And we all have those different frames. I feel a silver lining personally to have grown up in a relatively economically depressed area of rural upstate New York. I've seen poverty firsthand, deep poverty. But then I ended up going to a nice college, the University of Rochester, and I saw some eye-popping wealth there. So I've interacted with people all over the wealth spectrum. And we can remove ourselves from our natural frames, I think, by understanding that, for example, poverty is fundamentally different from the middle class, which is fundamentally different from the upper class, especially in the early developmental years of childhood. The difference in framing between a 10-year-old who's on food stamps versus a 10-year-old whose family owns a luxury yacht, or a 10-year-old whose family owns one of these $5 million lake houses, the difference between those two children's framing of the world, I think that's almost inconceivable to you or me. I think the gap might be too wide for any of us to truly understand. We can't see their pictures when we're standing inside our own frames, but we can at least try. We can think about what it must be like to be those two different children. We can try to walk a mile in their shoes. In fact, when we have that saying, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, that's another way of saying, get out of your frame and get into their frame. It might be more than just a thought experiment, though. You might have to see it for yourself, to talk to people who are different from you, to truly immerse yourself in the day-to-day aspects of others' lives. That might be one of the only ways to really get yourself out of your frame and into someone else's frame, to understand, if we're talking here about personal finance, to understand how other people have different views of money or resources or things or travel or experiences, to understand how other people have just a different frame than you. And one of the last framing ideas that I thought of, especially when it comes to money here, is this idea of who do you trust? Perhaps the easiest way to get out of your natural framing is by seeking mentorship or advice from a loved one, from a trusted counselor, from an older mentor, someone like that. One of the most rewarding aspects of the best interest, of running the best interest, is providing that exact kind of help to those of you who ask for it. And one of my favorite parts of my day job is understanding the frames of the people who I work with, then trying to act as this neutral third party to provide them advice in their best interest, uninhibited by the confines of their own frame. It's interesting working with someone who tends to be a chronic overspender and trying to pull back the reins on that by trying to remove them from their own frame, and I'm trying to provide them advice where I'm outside their frame and looking in. Or the opposite happens all the time too. People who are chronic underspenders and encouraging them to spend more. People who really like taking on risk, people who really like avoiding risk, and providing them advice, again, that is more neutral and uninhibited by their own frames, because without that kind of advice, they're likely going to stand inside their frames and do something that's suboptimal for who knows, for some sort of undetermined amount of time. Like all our frames, though, these people who I just mentioned, their frames make it challenging for them to see the bigger picture. A great example, I loved the conversations that I had here in the late July and early August of 2024 about the flash crash. If you don't remember, between I think mid-July and the first week of August, the S&P 500 dropped something like 8%. And then over the next 2 weeks, it recovered that full 8%. And here we are at the end of September, making all-time highs again. The conversations around that flash crash, the conversations where some people were really jolted by the market dropping so quickly, by seeing their portfolios drop so quickly, because in their frames, that was a very sudden exposure to risk that maybe they either weren't anticipating or they forgot what it was like. And it was very fun for me to have conversations and remind people that, hey, this is part of equity investing. Hopefully that sinks in. And over the long period of time, they start to realize, okay, yeah, these kind of corrections are just perfectly normal, par for the course. If it doesn't sink in and it causes them to lose sleep, well, there's another conversation to be had there. Anyway, the same goes for relationship problems, career advice, forks in the road. Try to find someone outside of your frame to talk to, and what advice can that person give to you? So thank you again to friend of the blog, friend of the podcast, Anthony, for the original quote that inspired this monologue today. And thanks to Canandaigua Lake, I suppose. Thanks to the flash crash for some of these anecdotes that fit in today. And I'd be interested what you all think, if you know yourself well enough to really define the confines of your frame, and then what actions you're taking to try to remove yourself from that frame or try to get outside perspective. Because there are times where I have doubts about how well I even understand my own frame, but I'm still trying to feel around in the dark for it.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you, but I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no-strings-attached subscription at bestinterest.blog.
Let's welcome Steve Adcock onto the podcast. Steve achieved financial independence at age 35 back in 2016. He quit full-time work and now lives a sustainable life in an off-grid home with his wife out in the middle of the desert. He shares his wisdom through his own brand, and he's got a couple brands. He's got steveadcock.us. He also has Millionaire Habits, which I think is his bigger brand. And we will talk about those things today, and we will share links to you listeners here in the show notes. Steve's also a regular contributor on MarketWatch, Forbes. He's on CNBC all the time. I think you're really going to enjoy the sharp and quippy nature of Steve's advice today. We have a fun conversation. So without further ado, here is Steve Adcock. Well, Steve, thank you for coming back. And thinking back to episode 16, when you originally were on the Best Interest podcast, which is over 3 years old at this point, I know at that time you gave us kind of this overarching fire journey, if you will, like, where you were as a young employee when you didn't know what you were doing in investing in personal finance all the way up till today or at that time. Just to ground the audience today, though, I thought a good place to start would be if you could remind us of where you were when you pulled the trigger on early retirement, when you said, today is my last day of work and I'm now fired or whatever you thought you were at the time. It's been 7 or 8 years. And then maybe if you could describe to us what your life has been like since then, and with a little bit of an emphasis on your financial life.
It was December 23rd of 2016. That was my last official day of working a full-time job. Best Christmas gift I could ever give myself. It was a very surreal moment because I was 35 years old at the time, and I knew unless something went terribly wrong, unless it all hit the fan, I was never really going to have to work another day for the rest of my life. And I emphasize that phrase, have to, because that's the beauty of financial independence. And I really like to consider myself to be more financially independent rather than early retired at this point. Because, one of the things that I've learned since retiring early is how many opportunities there are out there to get involved in stuff, just doing things. And when you have a marketable skill, guess what? Those things turn into an income. And that's really what has happened over the last 8 years. But I started right out of college when I was like 23 years old, 2004 timeframe. I remember my first day in the office like it was yesterday. Maybe it was my second day. I don't know. Really shortly after I first began my career, I was in the office. I took a look around at everybody just doing their job, sitting in their cube. And I was like, this is it? This is what I have to look forward to for the next, 40, 45 years of my working career? This is crazy. There's no way. Now, at the time, I didn't have anything figured out. I didn't have a concept of early retirement or financial independence. So believe me, I wasn't this money expert from the very beginning, and I had a plan. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had zero things, goose egg of things figured out at that time. All I knew was this probably wasn't going to work long term. Fast forward about 10 years, and I was the typical employee. I earned good money. I was a software developer at the time. So, in tech, in IT, you make good money. I had the house in the suburbs. I had the supercharged Corvette. I had the brand new Cadillac CTS. I had the Yamaha R1 sport bike. So I was having lots of fun.
Yeah, nice toys.
The insurance on that R1 was like $220 a month just for the insurance, by the way. Crazy, crazy, crazy. But people my age at 26 or something at the time, well, I guess it was a little older than that, but they kill themselves on bikes. They wreck their bikes all the time. That's why it was so expensive. But anyway, it was probably when I was 30, 31 years old. And that's really where I think the rubber met the road in terms of what I had to do with my future. It was a Saturday morning, just like any other Saturday. I walked out to my garage. I don't know where I was going, but I reached up to open up the garage door like I normally would, just robotically. But for whatever reason, something stopped me. I just didn't do it. I could not open the garage door. And then I turned around and I looked at what was in my garage, the house in the suburbs. Again, the Corvette, the sport bike, the Cadillac. I have all these toys. I have all the, the markings, the objects that's supposed to, mean success to a lot of people, and me included, quite frankly, at the time. But something was still missing. I still wasn't satisfied with what was going on in my life and what my future was going to look like. I was on this hamster wheel, I thought. Maybe it was golden handcuffs at the time. In fact, it probably was. But I think that was the first time where I admitted to myself that I can't just keep earning and spending, because I've done that. I'm doing that right now, and yet I'm still not happy. So this is not working for me. It's not going to continue working for me. Something has got to give. And at that point, that was like that light in my head finally got turned on. This cannot happen. This cannot continue forward. And around that time, I found, and if you follow the FIRE movement, I know you are familiar with this person. I found the Mr. Money Mustache blog, and he was a software developer just like me who earned good money just like me. He lived in Colorado, just one state north of me in Arizona. So I connected with him very, very well. I started following his journey, some of the things that he started to do to prioritize the financial independence part so he can quit or be able to do whatever he wants without having to worry about that paycheck, that twice a month paycheck. Slowly but surely, I started to put the pieces into place. I met my future wife, and that's really where things started to amp up. Because she's a rocket scientist, way smarter than I am, will always be smarter than I am. So the rocket scientists also make good money. So by the end of our careers in 2013, man, we were making 220 G's a year. And back then, that was good money. It's good money now, but it was especially good money back then. So we had a choice. We had a decision to make. I know I'm rambling here. I'll be done in just a second. We had a decision to make. We could either live like rock stars, the vacation home, expensive dinners, jewelry, movies, whatever, or we can start saving the vast majority of what we make, and we can do whatever we want with our lives for the rest of our lives. And ultimately, that's what we ended up doing. We saved 75% of our combined salaries, and our combined salaries was $220,000. So 75%, that's a hell of a lot of money, and that adds up quick. And we did that for about 3 years, sold everything, bought an Airstream, traveled the country for a living, got the travel bug out of our system to some degree. Then in 2019, we bought an off-grid house in the desert. And that's where we are now in 2024, just living the dream and doing whatever we want.
How was that lifestyle change initially? I could imagine for people listening right now, maybe they think they spend too much in their own life. But at the same time, the thought of going without some of the luxuries that spending buys them might be a little intimidating, or they might feel a little bit deprived without that. So what was that process like for you guys, whether just the logistics themselves or just the emotions involved between having all the toys in the garage and spending and living life that way, all the way down to saving 75% of your annual income?
I will tell you this, the hardest part, and this is probably true for almost everything, the hardest part is the beginning. Just getting over that initial hump of first deciding that this is not working, I'm going to do this, and these are the things I'm going to do to put that in place. That is by far the hardest part of this, wide scale lifestyle change. Living that change after you get through the initial hump, living that change is no sweat. I mean, I used to thought that I couldn't live without ESPN at one point in my life. But guess what? I'm not dead. I'm still here. I lived just fine, thank you very much, without the cable TV and lots of these other things that we stopped spending money on. I mean, we went out to eat maybe once a month. We gave ourselves $50 a month. That's it, to go out to eat. And I love going out to eat. Absolutely freaking love going out to eat. I love restaurants, the whole environment. I just love it. But we cut it back to maybe once a month. But you know what? Like I said, once you get over that initial hump, you really got to push through at the beginning. But once that snowball starts to build, it's like, this isn't so bad. That's not so bad. I didn't really need this anyway. Yeah, I guess it was nice to have, but I'm not really all that less happy because I'm not doing those things or I'm not spending money on those things. I think we realized that after a month or two, after making that initial, lifestyle change. It's like, this is no sweat. In fact, I wish we can do more. I wish we can cut back even more so we can get to financial independence even quicker. Now, of course, you have to balance that so your life doesn't feel like a sacrifice. Nobody wants to feel like they're sacrificing the things that actually mean something to you. So things are going to look differently to us versus you, of course. The things that we spend money on, you might not need to spend money on those things and vice versa. And that's fine. But I think the important thing to remember is to work backwards. Look at where you want to be and when you want to be there. So it's 2024 now. Let's say you want to retire or achieve financial independence, let's say, in 2028. So you got 4 years. So what do you got to do to get to that point in 4 years? How much money do you think you need in order to be financially independent in 2028? Then, how much money do you have to save? How much money do you have to invest, assuming maybe 6 to 8% gains if you're investing in the market over the years? And as you work backwards, you can slowly get down to that monthly budget, I think, that you have to stick to now in order to get to where you want to be then. And here's the secret. You will be surprised at how often you achieve results quicker, faster than you think you're going to. I wanted to retire at 40. That was my initial goal. Back then, back when I was 30, 31 years old, I wanted another 10 years and that's it. But we retired in 5. Now, granted, I did marry somebody with a salary, so that helped tremendously. It wasn't everything that just I did. So circumstances do affect that. By a large factor, circumstances can affect that. But if you put your mind to it, you set your focus to it every single day, and you really try not to waver, I think you're going to achieve that goal faster than you think you will.
Yeah, it's a practice, right? It's this ongoing practice of steady habits over time. It's the water that breaks through the rock over many years of erosion. It's that kind of thing, or at least that's the way that I approach personal finance and investing. It's these good habits, these millionaire habits, you could say, which we'll come back to that phrasing for you, Steve. But it's these habits that you just set up and practice over years at a time. And I agree with you that sure, you and I have had the tailwinds of a really nice stock market over the last 10 or 15 years that we've been really focused on this kind of stuff. Even without those really nice tailwinds, just the idea that over long periods of time, these investments tend to perform in the positive direction for us. And the thing that you can control is what you're saving, what you're spending, and to some extent what you're earning. Compounding happens pretty quickly, especially if you choose not to pay attention to it, or you only check in once in a while. You'll surprise yourself with what can happen over 3 or 6 months, over a year, over a few years. Thinking, Steve, through what it's been like for you from 2016 till today, I had some market thoughts for you, if you will, because I haven't spoken to you since 2022 happened. And I think 2022 was probably the first prolonged bear market that you and your wife went through. I mean, COVID sure was a bit of a shock for 2 or 3 months, but I'm just curious, when you guys, here you are earning some income, which I think is worth pointing out to the listeners, right? You've got all these interesting side hustles that you're still doing, but still your nest egg probably took a pretty big hit in 2022. But what was your mindset during that time?
I mean, we were down, and this was during the worst of COVID, about $220,000 in assets. So we weren't down that in liquid cash. We were down that in assets. Our stock values decreased by over 200 Gs. And it's like, yeah, that sucks. But when you have a long-term mindset, it really doesn't matter. So I know it's easy for us to say, but it didn't really factor into the equation whatsoever for us. And one of the things that's nice about our lifestyle is we chose to live off-grid, which means we don't have a power bill. We don't have a water bill. We do have a well on site that we get our water from. We power that with our solar system, and we have a septic system. So other than like internet and like basic insurance, we can live almost as cheap as we want out here. So I think that really helps with the expenses that fund our lifestyle. Right now, it's a little higher because the market's doing well. We're making good money. Why not enjoy ourselves? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that as long as you don't go overboard with it. But if that recession hits like in 2022, like during COVID, and you start to cut back those expenses, I mean, we can really live so darn cheap out here. And that's something that we actually did plan. We wanted to live off-grid, so we didn't have all these utilities. And it's really worked out super well for us. We did upgrade our system, so in the end, we probably spent more money with the batteries and the solar system than we would have spent just paying our monthly utility bill. But the other side of that is we spent that money when the market was good, which is exactly when you want to do some of those upgrades. So when the market tanks, if it does, well, when it does, it always does, it ebbs and flows, then you can cut back, but we already have that nice, quote unquote, expensive infrastructure in place that we bought when the market was up so we can enjoy it when the market's down. And when you have, like I said before, when you have that long-term mindset, these ebbs and flows really don't matter too much. We look at our finances maybe for 5 minutes a month. That's it. We're not moving money. We're not rebalancing. We don't do any of that. We are the perfect example of passive investors. Active investors, and especially day traders, tend not to make money compared with passive. Passive almost always, unless you're really good at what you do, almost always outperforms active investing and day trading, especially day trading. I don't like to look at stocks and yields and price to earnings ratios and what NVIDIA earned last quarter. I don't care. I just want to enjoy myself and I want to see my net worth rise. And that is where passive income investing really shines.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific role model for what all of our listeners should aspire to, Steve, is just to keep costs low, diversify. Passive investing is the way. Stick it out for the long run. You don't have to log in every week or every month. Not even every quarter if you don't want to. I wanted to go back to something you spoke about there, Steve, which was that you and your wife adjust your spending, or at the very least, you try not to plan any large expenses if the market's down. And that is exactly the same principle as what we talked about on a couple of recent episodes, one with Tyler from Portfolio Charts, the other with Rob Berger. I mean, that's essentially the sequence of returns risk that you're thinking about there, which is, sometimes returns will be poor, especially early in a retirement. It's possible. And ideally, if you can have flexibility in your retirement plan, you don't want to have to sell your shares when they're down to fund your lifestyle. You'd rather wait for the market to recover, and you should feel more optimistic and enthusiastic about spending your money at that time. So that's really smart. But that said, other than bear markets and bad asset performance, I feel like one of the other main fears of retirees is inflation, which we know has been in the headlines, has been real during your retirement, especially these last couple of years. So again, I mean, has inflation caused any sort of concern for you?
Not really. It might take us, if we wanted to go on a vacation or something, and now it costs $8,000 instead of $5,000. Maybe we would wait a little bit longer, but it's not necessarily like we wouldn't do it. We would just adjust accordingly. That's a discretionary spend. But what if it's like groceries or something that, we all got to eat, so we all have to pay whatever the supermarket wants to charge? Things are going up. There's no question about that. But then again, so are salaries, at least in concept. If you're not getting a cost of living raise, I think that's a huge, huge problem, because then your salary is not keeping up with inflation. But I think most of the time, there are things that you can do to help combat inflation spending. First, just don't spend money on the things that have increased enough. Now, obviously, you can't always do that, like in the case of food. But you don't always have to buy the name brand stuff. You can buy things that just happen to be on sale, even if it's not something that you have your heart set on, or, I love Ghirardelli chocolates. I have to have Ghirardelli chocolates, even though this other brand is half off. If it's important enough to you and your budget is, sensitive to the higher costs of inflation, start making those decisions. Start looking for those coupons. Start buying the things that are on sale. Don't necessarily always buy the name brand products if you can help it. I think those things will help you to save money, as well as buying in bulk, especially your staples. Cook more with rice and beans and those kinds of foods that are filling. They're relatively healthy. They got great macros. Lot of carbs with rice, of course, but there's usually things that you can do even with food that will help you stay healthy, but also minimize the impact on your wallet. It's going to take some practice. Like I said before, it's that initial lifestyle change, that initial, okay, this is not working for me. I have to do this now, and these are the things that I'm going to do to put that into place. Once you get that down, you're going to find probably 90% of the time, once you start getting into that new routine of buying these different things at the grocery stores, buying off brands at department stores, it's going to become second nature. It's like, this shirt's just fine. It was $15. It's not a $60 Ralph Lauren polo shirt. But you know what? I don't really need a $60 Ralph Lauren polo shirt. This one covers me just as well as that one did. Those kinds of decisions over time is going to make a big, big difference to your monthly budget.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into, I think of them as spending habits. And the one that I can, the anecdotal spending habit is, okay, here in Rochester, we're actually the home city of Wegmans grocery stores, which is this Northeast, East Coast, very highly respected grocery store brand. And if you've ever been in a Wegmans, it's got every kind of item you could ever imagine. Plus, it has a lot of extra stuff that's kind of cool, but of course expensive. There's an olive bar and all the different kind of cheeses you could imagine, and plenty of employees to always help you out. And not surprisingly, Wegmans prices have really been affected by inflation, possibly more than other grocery stores. I'm not really sure. But after seeing a few Wegmans bills over the last couple of years, I was like, I'm kind of in this money habit, if you will, of just, Wegmans is my grocery store. Automatic every time. And I don't really think twice about what I'm spending there as far as food goes. I'm making enough of a living that I want to eat what I want to eat. Well, then I went to Aldi, which for us is literally across the street from Wegmans. And man, if Aldi isn't, 60% of the price of Wegmans, I'd be shocked. I mean, it was I immediately noticed the difference. So now probably 3/4 of our grocery dollars are spent at Aldi. All the essentials, all the basics. Why would I buy oats at Wegmans if I can save $1 at Aldi?
Sure.
Why buy berries, et cetera? Sure, once in a while, something that's a little bit nice or a little bit special, or maybe Aldi just doesn't have it. But that's just one simple money habit, a simple one. And you could look at your home gym. You could look at the streaming services that you pay for. There are all these little money habits that we have built into our life, these spending habits. And it's easy just to overlook them. But if you actually open up the hood, odds are you could probably save some dollars there.
Streaming services. Boy, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but I'm really curious how many people quit cable to save money, but then spend just as much money, maybe even more, on all of these different streaming services. There's so many now. It seems like every single freaking channel has a subscription service that they want you to subscribe to. It's absolutely crazy. I think we have Netflix, we have Amazon Prime, we might have Paramount, but I think that's it. We got 3. That's pretty good. I think the average cable bill is in the neighborhood of $120 to $140 a month. And we probably pay $40, something like that. That alone, if you can just rein yourself in a little bit. But even with that, let me take a step back. Even with that, if that really, like, you get your jollies off by having access to all of these streaming services, and that really just deep down provides value to you and your family. Maybe you have family night, you all get together on Fridays or something, and you watch something. Those expenses can be worth it. It's not like you have to cut out all of these things that you otherwise would enjoy doing. The piece that I want you to remember here is, well, the key, I guess, is to be intentional with where you're spending your money and understand or be honest with yourself about, yes, I am spending X number of dollars on this service or on this product, and I am getting that amount of value out of it. If that's true, that's probably a good expense. But if you haven't watched, X streaming service or used X product in the last 3 months, guess what? You probably don't need that. Maybe cancel it and subscribe to it again if you need it in the future. But just take a look through your bank statement and your credit card. Just cursory look. Just go through each line at the end of this month and just see where all of that money is going. I bet you'll be surprised at how many subscription services you are still paying for and don't use and maybe don't even remember signing up for.
For those of you listening who just heard Steve say that and you think to yourself like, oh, well, that's just money basics. And, I kind of want something different than that. Or I don't want to go back to a budget and looking. Well, let me tell you this. So I work with, there's 7 CFPs on staff here where I work, certified financial planners, right? That's what we do here. We work with clients all over the spectrum. That is one of the fundamental things that we bring up with our clients. I'll ask, say, if I were to look at the last 3 months of your credit card statements, do you feel like right now, without looking at them, you've got a pretty good feel for what you spent and what you spent, how much you spent, all those kind of things? And if the answer is no, that's usually a bit of a yellow flag where we want to bring it up and we want to say, hey, the fundamental foundation of your financial life is what you earn and what you spend, period. So if you're not really sure what you're spending or how you're spending it, that is a problem that we need to address early on. So getting yourself familiar with how much you're spending on a monthly basis and what you're spending it on is huge. And you could have a PhD in economics and still not quite have that under control. It's worth understanding that.
Sad but true. I mean, I've never seen anybody eat fewer calories than normal and not lose weight. I've also seen nobody spend less than they make and not build wealth. It really is that freaking simple. It's not always easy depending on who you are and your circumstances. I get that. But the basics, we always have to go back to those basics because a lot of people simply don't have those down. I don't know how many people, what the percentage is now of people who couldn't fund a $1,000 emergency without going into debt because they have zero emergency savings. Zero. They just put it on their credit card and let it ride for 3 months. Guess what? Millions of people are in that boat. Those are the basics that millions of people still aren't able to grasp. Like you said, that's why we have to keep coming back to this because it is common. And if you do have those basics down, you are way ahead of the curve. But if you don't, then this constant reinforcement to look at those basics. Don't think you got to be in the clouds yet. Just start at ground level, build from there, and let that savings go. Let your investments go. And I think you're going to find that financial independence is going to happen way earlier in life than you expect it to. But you really got to start at that ground level.
I totally agree.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you.
I almost want to pivot a little bit, Steve. I want to shine a spotlight on your retirement story, your post-retirement story, if you will, because I think from the outside looking in, whether people are thinking about a traditional retirement or they're reading stories about the FIRE lifestyle, there's some semblance of, okay, I think by now we're past the meme of cocktails on the beach. We're past that part. But still, it's, okay, well, how much pickleball or golf are you going to play? You're going to volunteer at the library. Like, what are you going to do to fill your time? But I'm pretty sure that you've got a pretty unique retirement lifestyle that, like I alluded to before, you filled it with projects. Some of those projects pay you. And because they're paying you, maybe it means you don't have to lean on your portfolio quite as much. Can you dive into some of those details for us?
I don't think we've taken a dime from our investments since we've retired into, well, I use that term loosely, retired.
Yeah, you left the corporate world for sure, right? You left the corporate world. Yeah.
No question about it. That's the nice thing about FI. You can try different things, see what you like, see what you don't, ditch the things you don't like, keep the things you do, regardless of whether they pay you money or not. Who cares? If you enjoy doing those things, do them. That is the great thing about this lifestyle. So for me, I tried lots of different things. I tried YouTube. I even considered starting a podcast. I did not go down that road because that's just another thing on top of everything else I'm doing. But for me, it was the writing, starting a newsletter, getting involved on social media, and talking about these things over and over and over again. And now I earn thousands of dollars a month just by doing something that I probably would have been doing anyway. I didn't do it for the money, but I'm also not going to turn down money if it's a good opportunity for me. That's not a millionaire habit. You never turn down income unless it's going to negatively impact your lifestyle or your family. Those are two great reasons to turn down income. But for me, neither of those two were true. So now I am doing the things that I would do anyway. I've probably replaced 3/4 of my salary from the IT world, just having fun, writing about money, talking about money, engaging with people on social about money. That's what makes this early retirement lifestyle so rewarding. But I want you to remember, you might not replace 1/4 of your salary after you quit, but that's fine. The key is have a hobby, find out what you're good at and what you want to be doing after you achieve financial independence, and then quit your job, and then pursue that lifestyle. Do not pursue it before. There's a lot of people who have the money part down, right? They make lots of money. They have millions of dollars in investments. They don't want to work anymore, so they quit. They have no hobby. So what do? Get up, turn on Netflix. They binge on some series. They get caught up on this and that, whatever. And then 2 or 3 weeks down the road, I like to call this the bell curve of early retirement happiness. So at the beginning of early retirement, right, your happiness goes up. You're on the left-hand side of the bell curve. It's great. You no longer have to get up in the morning, well, at 6 a.m. or whatever. You have to get up eventually, but you can do whatever you want. You get to plan your day. You're just so unbelievably happy. That happiness level is just going straight up. You're on the left-hand side of that bell curve. But then, after 2-3 weeks, maybe 2-3 months, depending on who you are, your happiness begins to level off. So you're getting to the top of that bell curve, the very top. And it's like, you start to realize, maybe I can't just watch Netflix all day. Maybe this isn't going to do it for me for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And if you don't make a change, guess what happens to your happiness? You go down to the other side. You go to the other side, the right-hand side of that bell curve. It's like a roller coaster. Now your happiness actually decreases. And believe it or not, you might be in a position now where it's like, anything would be better than this. I can't imagine watching Netflix and being less happy than I am now. But you would be surprised that when your purpose is taken away from you, and even if you don't like your job, a lot of people derive purpose from what they do for a living. So if that is taken away from you, you have no purpose. You have no reason to get up in the morning. You're like, what is the purpose of life? And I know nobody thinks this is going to happen to them. I totally get it. But you would be surprised at how many people go through this very same dilemma. They retire from something. They don't retire to something. So you really, really, really have to have that to, like you're retiring to that next career, quote unquote. You have to know what that's going to be, and you have to be reasonably certain that you're going to be able to do it in early retirement before quitting. Otherwise, you have no business retiring early. You have no business quitting your job. You might as well just keep chugging down that road, keep earning that income until you have that critical piece about what's going to fill your life without a full-time job. That is absolutely key. If you don't have that, do not retire. Thankfully, I did have that. I knew what I was going to do. I didn't know what, like these exact pieces that I put in place now. I didn't necessarily have that figured out, but I had a good direction. I knew the things that I was going to start exploring with and playing with and seeing what works, and ultimately it did. But if you don't have that, just keep working until you have that post-career purpose figured out.
Yeah. Direction over details. I like that phrase a lot. Direction over details. You don't need to have all the details, but you really have to know your direction a little bit. And you reminded me, Steve, I might get this stat a tiny bit wrong, but this is from the Retirement Manifesto. This is from Fritz Gilbert. There's a stat out there that about 28% of retirees, now this is where it's important that I get it right. I know it's 28%, and it's either that at one point they go through a depressive episode related to being retired, or just that they are depressed in retirement. It's one of the two, and there is an important difference between those two, but the upshot or the lesson I take from that is that it's very easy to enter retirement. And of course, like you said, start off on this high because great, you've now untethered yourself from daily work, or at least, a daily job, the corporate world, whatever it may be. But then how are you going to fill the void of those social connections? How are you going to fill the void of that feeling of accomplishing something? That's fun too. How are you going to fill those 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day where you used to be grinding? And sure, maybe grinding wasn't always fun, but at least you were doing something productive and your brain needs that. There's a second great stat, and then I'll throw it back over to you, where
Sure.
the number one concern for the average pre-retiree is financial. If you were to list out all, pre-retirees and what their concerns are, the most common, biggest concern is financial. But finances are rarely one of the top concerns for post-retirees because they realize the finances are fine, just like the position you find yourself in and that you alluded to. But many post-retirees realize, oh, there's so much more to life that I was kind of overlooking, and now there's this void, and I'm not quite sure how to fill it.
I don't think my wife would mind me saying this, but she went into that depressive state about a year after she left her job. And she was filling that void with just reading. She would read literally all day long because it was just something to distract her from the fact that she had nothing to do. And this was back when we were traveling full time in our Airstream. I was on the computer doing my thing, but she didn't really have that. She didn't have something to do every day. And she was getting pretty depressed. And she got a little bit more involved with the YouTube channel that we were doing at that time. Ultimately, we stopped doing that. Now she's doing a lot of real estate that keeps her busy, and even some engineering now on the side as well. So she did eventually find that. It kind of meant her working more of a traditional job now than traditional retirement, I guess. But we definitely do have firsthand knowledge of how common that can be. and how easy it is to fall into that, because nobody thinks they're going to have that problem. Otherwise, they wouldn't retire. All they know is, I don't like this, so I want to get away from this. But they don't necessarily stop to think about where they're going to. They're just so concerned about getting away that they don't have the right direction, or they don't have a direction at all. So Fritz's stat, I'm sure it's 28% in some point in their early retirement lifestyle experience some type of, quote unquote depression to a varying degree, which is so unbelievably common. That's almost a third of people. That's an incredibly high number of people who are retiring to nothing. So I know I'm belaboring the point here, but I'm doing that because it's incredibly important not to sever your link to purpose, to communication, to, your social outlet, to a reason to get up in the morning. You cannot sever that until you have something in place that you're going to retire to. Cannot stress that enough.
Steve, I feel like you've delivered so many powerful points today succinctly, and you've worded and you shared your stories with us so well, and you've shared some of these millionaire habits with us so well. And I'm bearing the lead here. I brought up that term 8 times. Tell us what Millionaire Habits is. Tell us where listeners can reach out to you, can follow you, can hear more of what you have to say, can connect with you.
Millionaire Habits is the newsletter that I send out once a week. I go through a lot of the topics that we discussed today just in email, so it goes straight to your inbox, absolutely free. I do have a paid upgrade for more content if that's what you're into, which of course I would highly recommend that, because I do give a lot more value to the premium subscribers of my email list. But it's at millionairehabits.us. You'll see a little sign up form there if you scroll down just a little bit. I also have a bunch of other resources on that website for you to go through, from beginner to advanced and everything in between. That's where I spend the majority of my writing time, at millionairehabits.us. If you are on Twitter, I'm on Steve on Speed. That's my handle. Has nothing to do with drugs. I never did speed. It was back when I had my Corvette. I like to go fast. I started this Twitter account back then. Should have changed it a long time ago, but that ship has sailed. So anyway, on Twitter, or X, I guess now, Steve on Speed, and Instagram at Millionaire Habits, without the I and the A in the habit. So that's where you can find me, and that's where I spend probably way too much of my time, but I just love it too much to step away from those outlets.
Well, those links for you listeners, everything will be in the show notes for you to easily and quickly find it. And Steve Adcock, Millionaire Habits, thank you for coming on the Best Interest Podcast for a second time.
You are very welcome. I am glad to be here. And I got to say, you were great the first time, but you were even better this time. You're getting way more. You are a natural at this, my friend. I just love the progression that your podcast has taken and what you're doing with it. So great job. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Steve.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Best Interest Podcast. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves, and we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Best Interest Podcast. The Best Interest Podcast is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice and is not prescriptive of your financial situation.